cracking all sorts of ideas.
And I think and that's really fascinating. But just switching gears a little bit, and we're going to go forward in time, because I would love everybody to know about about Kit Moran and how you were able to come around to writing that story, the research behind that. Please tell that story, because you told me.
Okay. Well, as I said, that was one of these inspirational things I was writing. I was working on I had finished and republished the book on the Battle of Britain, and there were two secondary characters in that book which I felt deserved more attention. So I had developed novellas about each of them, and I was going to release that as just two books, as just, two novellas. That's sort of a continuation, like a footnote to, and I was feeling very smug and good with myself. And so I was sitting down with my husband over a glass of wine, and I just was like, I can't, the book isn't finished because I have to do the two isn't enough. You need the third leg, which looks at somebody who's been accused of lacking moral fiber, which was the RAF term for being a coward,
right,
for failing to do your duty. And so I thought, that was one of these, this was totally inspirational. It was like, I had not planned that. I had not ever looked into it. I didn't know enough about, I'd heard the concept. I knew people did that. So I have, the trilogy was one of the stories is about someone who suffered disfiguring facial injuries and goes through one of McIndoe's guinea pigs, getting plastic surgery, early plastic surgery, and that whole identity crisis. Another was about the class differences in Britain, and a widower with teenage children trying to do what's good for them in an environment which was not very friendly to single parents, let alone single male parents, and falling in love with a woman who's definitely not his class in the sense she was too far above him, and the problems that made. So those, and then all of a sudden I had to do this thing about coward. I didn't know enough about it. So I started doing the research, and by chance, I was then working with a graphic designer who was working at the University of Leicester. And she said, well, let me check our libraries. And she sent over to me 3 articles from the British Journal of Medicine, the Journal of Military Medicine. I'd have to go back and check, but very, very scholarly works, which go back and analyze the whole RAF's policies, how many people were affected, how many people, and all of a sudden I had a picture that was very different from the legends.
Yes.
And that started getting me, so the legend is the RAF would just label people lacking in moral fiber, and then they would have their rank and their medals stripped off and their air badges, and they were sent to clean latrines to work in the morgue, or actually even dishonorably discharged and sent to work in the mine. And then I have all this evidence from RAF statistics showing that actually 30% of the men actually went back to operational flying. Another 3% went back, or 7% went back to non-operational flying, and others went back to ground duties. And in fact, only about 1% were actually disciplined,
right,
and suffered. So then I started looking at, wait a minute. So this was a much more complex project, and the psychiatrists, the people who are thrown off their squadron for lacking moral fiber, and that happened overnight. If somebody refused to fly, they were considered a risk to morale for the rest of the squadron.
Yes.
And also, there were instances of one of the interesting case, again, personal, an autobiographical, talking about he was a pilot of a Lancaster bomber, and his tail gunner, which is the most important gunner on the ship because they were being attacked. Often the Germans like to come in behind and under the tail and shoot up under them because they couldn't be seen in that position. His tail gunner started pulling out the intercom and not responding to orders, but also he was not giving his pilot warnings. He was endangering every man on the plane. So the pilot had to go to the squadron leader and say, I can't fly with this man. Yeah. He's cracked up. He cracked up because of another incident where somebody there was a hole in the plane and somebody fell out. they managed to drag him back in. I mean, it's very dramatic because he half falls out of the plane, and it takes 3 other crewmen, of course, fighting the drag on the plane and in the freezing wet to get him back in. But after that, this tail gunner just stopped functioning. He was what the RAF would call lacking in moral fiber. He had lost the confidence of his commanding officer.
Right.
But the pilot himself said, I don't think he shouldn't be punished.
Yeah.
and that's what it came down to. Actually, the RAF as a whole had a lot of sympathy for people who were suffering from PTSD. They knew if people had done their best and couldn't cope anymore, and they tried to help them. But they also had instances of people who went through training and therefore weren't serving in the Navy or the Army for 18 months. And just as they finished all this expensive training, they said, oh dear, I really don't think I'm up to this.
Yeah.
How sad is it? Well, they were called lacking moral fiber, and they did tend to get disciplined,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So there was a clear, very, very clear distinction as a whole, and there could have been cases of individual cases of injustice or unfairness, but as a whole, the operational squadrons understood who had done their best and just couldn't anymore, and they knew people who weren't really trying, and they had a different kind of treatment. But anyway, so I got into this whole story of Kit, and I wrote the novella where he's been thrown off his squadron for breaking down, for refusing to fly, and then I describe in flashbacks how he got there. And then I ended that book, and I was very proud of myself. It's a dramatic ending, because it's interspersed. He's interviewing, he's going through treatment with a psychiatrist. So he's having the therapy sessions, and then he's having the flashbacks, or then he has a visit from someone, or he tries to call a friend's parents, and they just tell him they won't talk to cowards. So you're having these, but always coming back to the therapy sessions. And in the final therapy session, which I won't give away, it's a surprise endings, I think, or supposed to be anyways. And and then I'm very pleased. I was myself feeling so great about this, and sending it out to test readers and everything. And then that was why I woke up in the middle of the night and said, that was just a teaser. Because now you have to tell what happened after that.
Yeah.
That's the hook, dear. But you still have the whole story of what happens in the last year of the war to this young. So I ended up writing the longer book, which is called Moral Fiber, where I take up that theme of moral fiber, but not just in the context of the RAF, but in the context of civilians working, and one of the characters, the father of the girl woman he's in love with, but she's not so keen at the beginning, is a pastor, is an Anglican minister, and he's concerned about the moral fiber breaking down across Europe, and what just Nazism, and what are we going to behave like the Nazis when we bomb Dresden, and he's concerned about the moral fiber of society. She's concerned about moral fiber in her context as a teacher. He's still struggling with it in the context of combat, so that it becomes a more general look at war. And I consider moral fiber goes beyond being a war story. It's very much, I consider it a very what do you call it, spiritual book, about which should be relevant to anybody regardless of the context in which you're living.
Right. And it's definitely the theme throughout the book. And that was one of the things I noticed too when we reviewed it, is that you were able to maintain that theme, and all of the characters in some way or another had to deal with that issue in their own personal life, and like you said, on a grand scale. And I thought it was a remarkable. Michael, do you have anything?
I think one question that I had was just because you talk about writing not just several books about a single topic, but writing them sort of in a row. So going from Sparta to the Crusades to the Battle of Britain. I feel that whenever I finish a novel about a certain topic, just with the mental concentration it takes to do that and then edit it and everything, that there's a feeling of I don't want to think about this topic for a while now. And you don't seem to have that, at least for half a dozen books in a row. That's right.
That's right. It depends obviously what your topic is. If it's something as broad as ancient Sparta, I mean, if you write the story, the first book I wrote, one of the books I wrote was about the sport in Ayoyi, which is the upbringing, the school, which is so misportrayed in 300, and most of the books out there described as something horrible. Well, it wasn't. It was a public schooling system. They learned to read, they learned to write, they learned to dance and sing. And yes, they learned also what was important to be a soldier, but being a good soldier in any age is not just about following orders. It's also about being able to take care of yourself, knowing medicinal plants and first aid. It's about tracking and keeping yourself in food when you're cut off from your unit. It's about, which is the whole thing, maybe the stealing was also to train soldiers how to survive in an environment. So it's, that book is very much about this topic of the Spartan upbringing. That doesn't tell you anything about how women were treated in Sparta, which is a totally different fascinating time. So once you've learned about ancient Spartan society and you realize how different it is from the common perceptions, there's a lot of different themes or different topics within that broader talk of ancient Sparta, which required a different me addressing it. So the books, I think normally when people write a historical novel, it's like that story about maybe the woman or her husband saying he'll kill me. You know, you have a story, and once you've written that story, you said it. I've said it. You know, there's nothing more to say. But when I talk about writing about Sparta or the Crusader states, I'm talking about such a wide topic that there's a lot of different stories in that.
Yeah. It's kind of like I think about Ken Follett, you know, whenever he wrote about the pillars of the earth, and it seems to just be a continuation of books, because he starts expanding into other people's stories and the generational thing, so it continues.
That's one way you either cut it into. That was one of the things the Battle of Britain book is too long, and people criticize me for that. So I ended up, the Leonidas book is actually only one book, Michael, but because people said that people don't want to read 800 pages, I broke it into 3 parts.
I do. I want to read 800 pages.
But I think it is easier. Does that answer the question, Michael?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, so can you tell us, Helena, are you working on anything now? Do you have anything coming up?
Oh yeah, well, the book that we just published was Cold Peace.
Yes.
Which is the first. So that's the same thing. It's one topic, Michael, but I've cut it into 3 pieces because otherwise I wouldn't be able to give each piece as much attention and detail as I'd like. So the topic is the Berlin airlift, which I hope will interest people. The trouble is that people don't really remember what it is. Everybody's heard of World War I or II, and they maybe have heard of the Crusades. A lot of people don't even know what the Berlin airlift was, but it was a response to Soviet aggression. The Soviet attempt to take control of Berlin, which was at that time, West Berlin was occupied by the West. Well, Germany had been divided into 4 zones, and Berlin itself had been divided into 4 sectors, and the Berlin, however, was located deep inside the Soviet zone, so that the Russians tried to take control of West Berlin, probably as the first step to taking over all of Germany. Certainly the tensions were moving in that direction. And they cut off all access to food, water, and most important, they couldn't cut off water, they couldn't cut off food, electricity, coal, which is important for heat and for electricity production. And they cut that all off to the citizens of Berlin, to the 2.2 million civilian residents. And the assumption was, because the Western powers it was literally 1 fighter plane to every 100 Russian fighter planes. It was 1 soldier. We had 8,000 troops. They had over 4.5 million troops in the immediate vicinity. We had, ridiculously small numbers of troops. We could not have defended ourselves. The army said it'll take them half an hour to even if we fight. And the assumption on the part of the Russians is that we would pull out. The general commanding U.S. forces in Germany wanted to call the Russian bluff because he didn't think they would actually use force. He thought if we showed a show of force, if we sent our convoy in with tanks in front of it and fighting troops, the Russians would not fire at it. The British, London and Washington, was not willing to take that chance. So they decided to keep the city alive by air as long as they could, knowing that it was impossible because there had been 14,000 tons of material, 14,000 tons of material going in every day. And that didn't include milk and fruit and vegetables and coal, which had come from the immediate surrounding area of the Soviet zone. And the transport fleet, the United States Air Force had exactly 2 cargo planes in Frankfurt at the start of the blockade, or the airlift. Britain could call on their entire transport fleet from the UK, but we're talking about planes that could carry exactly 3 tons apiece. And even when they pulled in the larger planes, the very largest planes there, of which we only had 3 or 4, could carry 20 tons, but they were too heavy for the runways in Berlin, so they could not be used. So basically the largest planes were 10 tons, and try to count up the number of planes you have to land in Berlin to bring in 14,000 tons of goods on 2 airstrips, neither of which had concrete runways when the airlift started. It really looked completely hopeless. And that was before you even factor in the fact that in the winter, when it gets dark and the fog rolls in, you can't land anything.
Yeah.
But they started the airlift as a stopgap measure to try to win time for negotiations. And the Russians just laughed up their sleeves, saying, General Winter's a Russian, he's always fought on our side. Why should we negotiate? And it evolves. The long story is they win. The Russians have to back down. They lift the blockade in May of 1949. The airlift wins, and they continue then flying goods in to have reserves in Berlin, which do not stop until the reunification of Germany in whenever it was, 89 was it? So it's a really exciting story. It's got lots of moving pieces, lots of moving parts. I think it's relevant for 2 reasons. I pointed this out to Harper's Magazine, was that some experts are saying the Chinese will not invade Taiwan. They will blockade it. So we may have a very similar situation. Now what? How do we get stuff in? And the other one, of course, is parallels between Stalin's Russia and Stalin's Soviet Union and Putin's Russia are pretty obvious. So I think it's got a lot of relevance for today's world. It's a fun book because you have, when I'm writing, I have American characters, I have British characters, I have German characters. I actually even have 2 Ukrainian characters, but they're minor because I haven't lived in the Soviet Union or in Russia, modern Russia, and I don't feel entirely comfortable trying to depict the mentality of the Russians.
Well, that's super fascinating.
Can I ask 2? I actually have 2 follow-ups after that.
Sure, go ahead.
And getting kind of a long episode, but
that's okay. We can split it. I'd love to do that.
The first question is, do you touch on the candy bombers?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
So that's the main American story. Is that humanitarian? The brilliance. It really is an individual initiative. I think I love it. So American because it's an absolute private initiative. It's an individual who just feels like he's got to do something for these kids and starts giving them the candy, and then his commanding officer finds out, and the commanding officer of the airlift says, you're doing the right thing, and institutionalizes, get the Confectioners Association of America involved, they get schools in America involved, and it's so interesting. Every pilot just picks up his parachutes, and as he flies into Berlin, he starts dropping them. So that's a really it's very important, and I worked that in that my fictional American character I put as co-pilot on Halverson's plane, so that I don't want to take away from Halverson. He's he came out with who he is, and I want him to be the hero. But to show it, to have it part of it integrated into the novel, I have another fictional American be his co-pilot and flying with him, and then in the notes I say the name of the real co-pilot.
Yeah.
But really, really important, of course, is that the Berlin airlift changed German attitudes towards America. The Germans had become very disillusioned, very bitter about the Americans, and therefore it's very important to have the German characters. And I've taken characters from my book on the the German resistance to Hitler, which is a very dismal book because most of them die. But a few of the survivors I brought back into this book, and I think that's important to show there were Germans who were anti-Hitler and how they're coping with this post-war situation.
Yes.
And then my lead characters are actually RAF, and their kits comes back, and then from my Battle of Britain book, Robin and Emily come back. So, and because the British contribution to the Berlin airlift is usually overlooked and forgotten, and it was absolutely vital to the morale of the city, because the American General Tunner is very focused on tonnage. He was called Tonnage Tunner because he wanted the maximum numbers of coal delivered and food delivered, medicine delivered. And so it had to work like clockwork, and they flew in and they unloaded in record time. They turned around, they got back out, and there was one-way traffic in and one-way traffic going out. And absolutely, as only one kind of aircraft, so only one kind of spare parts needed, only one kind, one kind, everything. But there was no room for taking passengers out. There was no room for evacuating sick people because they take time. They would have cut into his tonnages. A plane has to stop and help sick people on board to get them back.
Right.
Tunner didn't want to do it. The other thing he refused to do was take back cargoes. But the Berlin city government said every factory that we close down creates unemployed people that are dissatisfied, and they decide they prefer communism after all. So keeping the factories running was a priority for the Berlin government, the German government, the Berlin city government, and the British picked that up. So they reduced their tonnage for the sake of being able. When they offloaded, then they reloaded cargoes. Products produced in blockaded Berlin, and they were all labeled as produced in blockaded Berlin, with the Berlin Bear breaking its chains. Beautiful. And they also evacuated in the end 17,000 sick, particularly young children, undernourished children. And they also took over the awkward cargoes like liquid fuels. They brought in all the diesel, they brought in all the aviation fuel, the gasoline, they brought in salt. So it was a much more diverse and they've used a lot of civilian companies. The RAF put in every single transport airport they had was engaged, and it wasn't enough. So they had, have to check the number, I think it was almost 50 different civilian companies were chartered to fly on the British airlift, and including Freddie Laker and Bennett and many people who were later had their own airline companies, started on the airlift. And they were very diverse. And so that's sort of the British storyline has RAF, but it also has the civilian company. I have them doing an air ambulance business.
That's so. It just goes to show you've done a brilliant job on your research. So this, really, everybody listening should understand that the research that Helena has done is definitely you can definitely tell it in your books.
Well, it helps that I wrote a nonfiction book on the Berlin airlift called Blockade Breakers back in 2008. Right. So I did this massive amount of research for that. And I have a library here that I can go back to. So when I decided it was finally time to do the novel, I basically, first of all, I read my own book again. And then I went and read back to, my own sources, which I had here. And when I did the research for that, I did a lot of interviewing. I did a lot of oral history. I interviewed a lot of people, went to the UK. I interviewed a lot of people. Of course, I was living in Berlin at the time, so I met a lot of Germans. And I have these firsthand accounts. And that's what makes a novel work. It's
absolutely. And you can tell, you can definitely tell it. Yes. Well, we really appreciate you being on the show today, and we are so excited for Cold Peace and for all of your books, and we wish you so much success in all of it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, giving me this chance.
Absolutely. And for all the fans listening in, you can learn more about Helena and her books at www.helenapschrader.com. And you can find the link and more info in today's episode description. You can also go to our YouTube channel and find the content episodes of Moral Fiber and the Berlin Airlift to discover even more historical content about Helena's books and that astounding World War II event. As always, we thank everyone for listening, and please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Next week's episode, we are featuring historical author Danuta Pfeiffer and her award-winning books about the Underground Railroad and the Oregon Trail. This is DK Marley and
Michael Zucker,
and we're with the History Bards podcast. We ask you to keep making history and keep listening.